ready to go. Good morning, everyone. This is Jim Wieser of the Wieser Podcast. I'm glad to be back again, and especially today. This is a treat, believe me, and I know you're going to enjoy it. We're going to have a great podcast today. I have a wonderful guest, and I'm going to kind of pick up where I left off on my prior podcast. And you may recall, and I'll just do this very quickly. The prior podcast was 2 days after Easter, and I had a podcast ready to go, or at least in my mind I did, prepared, and it had, at that time, nothing to do with either the President of the United States or the Pope. And when I read the infamous Easter screed by our president, and saw the Easter message by the Pope, it dawned on me that I just couldn't stay out of the national realm anymore. I had to jump into it, and so I did, and I'll get into that in a second. And this is but this is a bit of a follow-up to that show. Because it hasn't gone away, I'm sure, as you have all noticed. So I figured I needed to get myself like the world expert on all things Christian and Catholic, and all things about the Pope. And so I thought about a dear friend of mine, who I have had the pleasure and the honor of knowing for a number of years now, and as you'll find out as we get into the show, he's got a very intriguing background and incredibly knowledgeable, and has some connection, I would say, with our Holy Father. And so what I'd like to do right now is introduce my guest to begin the show. And I'm going to say a couple of things that I know about him, but then I want you to fill in and tell everybody the larger story and the bigger story. And so I have sitting here with me this morning to my right is Father Mike Sorofka. Father's a Catholic priest with the Franciscan order, and I'm not technically proficient enough to tell you what that really means. I know there's orders in our Catholic Church. I myself was educated by the Jesuits in an order. And the Pope is also a member of an order, and I'll let you go into that because it ties into a theory that we're going to discuss here today, that somehow the Speaker of the House and the Vice President think they're greater theologians than the Pope as it relates to that. But Father Mike is currently, I'm not sure your title at the cathedral, Father. Is there a title that goes along with that?
There is, yes.
Okay.
I'm called the rector of the cathedral.
Okay. Not the wrecker,
Not
rector.
the wrecker,
okay.
no.
Okay. Father's the rector of the Holy Angels Cathedral in Gary, and has been there for a number of years. But prior to that, when I had the good fortune to meet him, he was the pastor at Holy Name Church in Cedar Lake, as the Franciscan order had become in charge of that church, and he was, I think, the second pastor, that came, and that's where we met. Found him to be an incredibly fascinating gentleman, and a great pastor, and now is working at the cathedral and with the church doing the city of Gary, or working with the city of Gary. I know some other things in your background, Father, and one thing I do want to let everybody know is, although Father was originally from the South Side, he his family moved to the town of Munster when you were in maybe 8th grade or something.
8th grade, Jim, yeah.
8th grade. And so he's a local guy. He's essentially from here. Went to Munster High School, and then I can let him fill you in on some further background, especially his training in the priesthood. Then we're going to get right into the discussions of the day regarding the viewpoint, or our perspective, Father's perspective and my perspective, of the issues the issues that have been created by the president and have been commented upon by many people, including the Pope. So I know that you graduated from Munster High and then had some wayward years at IU.
Oh, Ball State.
Ball State. I'm sorry,
Oh,
Ball
yeah,
State. That's
yeah.
right. I should remember that because we talked about that. And my sister-in-law is a Ball State graduate, an architect, and so I should not have missed that because I remember that.
Right.
But why don't you go ahead and kind of, if you can, take it from there.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. Thanks for the invitation.
Sure.
Now we can do in public what we do when we get together.
Yeah.
Our favorite topics are the two things people shouldn't talk about with each other in polite company: religion and politics.
Yep.
and here we are doing it, and I'm just so grateful for this opportunity. And actually, those have been my biggest interests since as long as I can remember. Even as a kid, I was in fourth grade. I remember I discovered the Bible and the Chicago Tribune all in the same year. And so I've been a religious kid and a news junkie ever since.
There are some people that think the Chicago Tribune is their Bible.
Well, and so I've always been intrigued by the connection between being a believing person and what happens in the world, and how do they inform each other. I mean, even as a kid, that's why when I got to college, I majored in political science, came perilously close to becoming a lawyer. I went to IU Law for a year until the Lord called me to this way of life. So that's a bit of my background through the interests I have. And, you know, when I finally went to the seminary, I joined the Franciscans because of the image, the legacy of St. Francis of Assisi, who was a man of peace and a man of concern for the poor, really a man who went out to the margins and found God there and preached reconciliation and healing and so I was drawn to that, so that when I joined the Franciscan order and got into my formation years. We studied at Catholic Theological Union in Chicago, CTU in Hyde Park, which happens to be the school that Pope Leo attended. He graduated a couple of years ahead of me. So I have the same degree from the same school, from the same professors as Pope Leo. So I don't know what that... I'm not a pope, but I got a good education.
Yeah. I think that gives you some credibility here, I think. Absolutely.
One of the things that CTU offered was an opportunity to study a program called the United Nations and World Faith. It was a certificate offered through CTU and Long Island University and the UN, and it was fascinating. So I did that certificate program to see how they could join up. What is the relationship at the global level? So the Catholic Church is a global church. The UN is a global organization. So the two largest global entities in the world coming together, it made perfect sense for me. So it was fascinating. And at the time, the Franciscans were thinking about getting involved at the UN as an NGO presence. And so I was involved with helping prepare the way for that and served with that project for a few years, including 3 years full time after I was ordained.
At the United Nations?
Well, I had the best job in the order. I lived in New York, but I worked for Rome. So I was assigned to the headquarters of the order in Rome. Did a lot of work at the UN headquarters in New York. Expanded some presence in Geneva and Nairobi. Part of my job was to travel around the world and work with friars in other countries to integrate them into this project. It was largely a Western European U.S. initiative. The Minister General of the Order said we need to globalize this with the friars. So my job was to go literally around the world and work with friars in all these countries and introduce them to how they can bring their concerns to the UN system.
And friars, for the uninitiated, are not folks that cook the chicken or anything.
No.
Maybe you can let them know that what a friar is.
Although I do cook a nice chicken, I'll tell you that.
I agree.
But,
You do. This man is quite the chef.
Yeah, so I'm the word friar. We're not monks. They say my habit. We call this robe, and they think, oh, you're a monk. And no, monks stay in monasteries. Friars comes from the word which means brother. We travel around. And I was one of the most traveled around friars. I was in 28 countries in 3 years over that UN term. And seeing the world literally from Franciscan eyes, from the perspective of friars who are working in very poor places, some war-torn places, some very ancient places, some historic places. What a fascinating view. And to help them bring their perspective of their concerns, of the people they serve, to a global stage. So that was my assignment.
Well, you could tell Father Mike's been a well-traveled person, and I've always found it fascinating, someone that's in an order like yourself, how someone that's had that incredible experience, that global experience, finds himself one day the pastor of Holy Name Church in Cedar Lake, Indiana. How does that happen?
I wonder myself sometimes, Joe. Well, we take a vow of obedience. We belong to a community of other friars, and we have commitments we make as a community. And so we need to have our skills, our gifts, whatever we have available to the service of the larger community. And so after serving at the United Nations, I taught freshman high school religion. I was a pastor in the inner city in Cleveland. I did recruiting for the order, back to parochial work in Cedar Lake because there was a need and I was free, and so there we go.
You know, when Father and I first met, myself just being a parishioner at Holy Name, and Father becoming the pastor, and we connected early on, one of the things that kind of brought us together was his involvement in Cleveland and in the inner city in Cleveland, because I went to college in Cleveland to John Carroll University, which was a Jesuit school.
Right.
No offense or anything.
Oh, they're great guys, yeah.
And Father's experiences in, I think 15 years or something you were there? Mm-hmm. His experiences in Cleveland are simply amazing. The work that he did in the inner city, which he's now doing in Gary, and it's pretty impressive. So I wanted everybody to get a sense of what his background is, because he has a rather unique background and a very impressive background for what we're going to get into now. And one of the things that I found interesting when we talk, which we often do, and is your background in the putting together your experience, your global experience as a Franciscan and politics. I mean, a lot of people. I mean, we do have a doctrine called separation of church and state. I think it's been a little distorted in the last number of years, but we do have that doctrine. So I find it a little bit unusual that a Catholic priest would have the educational background that you have in that, as well as the interest in it, which kind of leads us into what's going on now. I just want to remind everybody that when I did the podcast a couple weeks ago and delved into this topic, the one thing I said, what I did after I saw the president's Truth Social statement, and which was to me offensive, politically offensive, morally offensive, personally offensive, politically offensive. I thought, well, what's the contrast? So I looked. I went and got the Pope's Easter message, and I printed it out, and I just said, and I highlighted something, and that's what I'm going to roll with now, and then we'll get into the discussion. It said, in the light of Easter, let us allow ourselves to be amazed by Christ. Let us allow our hearts to be transformed by his immense love for us. Let those who have weapons lay them down. Let those who have the power to unleash wars choose peace. Not a peace imposed by force, but through dialogue. Not with the desire to dominate others, excuse me, but to encounter them. That's just a part of what he said. And it makes me think of something, and since you were a political science major, as was I had a book my junior year, the book that we used for politics, the title for global politics, international politics, I think was the title of the course, and it was called Swords into Plowshares, which I thought was a fascinating title for a book. It fit kind of the mission and understanding of John Carroll University, but I thought it was interesting, and it goes right to what was said, what the Pope said. But one other thing, I read the New York Times. I don't know if you know or have ever read the columnist Maureen Dowd.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting lady, clever, funny at times.
She doesn't hold back.
She doesn't hold back at all. And she did a column in Sunday's New York Times. And she's turned away from the church. She was born and raised a Catholic, a very, very strong Catholic. She turned away from the church for reasons. And she said, but I'm watching the Pope and I'm listening to the Pope. And I think I'm beginning to understand him and beginning to understand what I'm missing in my religion. And I might have to rethink this. Now, that's how it started. But she said something in the column, and it was not necessarily what she said, but this is from the Pope. It wasn't in his Easter message, but this is from the Pope, and she said, God does not bless any conflict. Anyone who is a disciple of Christ, the Prince of Peace, is never on the side of those who once wielded the sword and today drops bombs. And I thought, and that made me think of my instruction way back in the late 60s in college, Swords into Plowshares. And I think we could maybe, if we could, just kind of kick off from there. And what I want to start with in terms of the substance of what we're talking about is a lot's been said over the last couple of weeks about the just war theory. Mm-hmm. Not meaning just war, but just, meaning a fair, legitimate theory of war. And suddenly a relatively new person to Catholicism, the Vice President of the United States, became the leading theologian in the country on it, as well as the Speaker of the House. I know he claims to be a Christian. I just don't know what his sect is. But anyway, if you could, let's start with there, because I know the theory started, I didn't start with, but the person that kind of crystallized it was St. Augustine. And I know that the Pope has some connection to that. So why don't you, if you can, from your perspective, go into that?
Sure. Here we are for graduate seminar
Yeah.
in Catholic social teaching. Let's start even before Augustine, because Augustine didn't kind of create it out of whole cloth. He inherited a tradition and then really formalized it. So he took the elements that were there and then structured it into something that was more integrated and coherent, all put together. Remember, the Christian movement for the first 300 years of history was not having a pleasant experience at the hands of armies. And so you have 300 years of Christian tradition that was very anti-war, anti-violence. This is the beginning of it. We didn't just sort of come up with this, in last Sunday, And so when things changed and the persecutions ended in the early 300s, and Augustine is in the 400s, so this is only relatively recent to Christian peace. So Augustine, it's putting that in the context. He just wasn't sitting at his desk saying, what do we think about war? What's up with this war stuff? And many Christians during that time wondered whether you could be a Christian and also a soldier. In fact, St. Martin of Tours is the patron saint of the military and of conscientious objectors. Both.
Interesting.
Yes. Look that one up on the Google machine. Yeah. I'm saying the context is the Christian community is struggling. What do we do about war now that we've got the sword, and we're beginning to get in charge of things? How do we wield that sword? Should we? That was a huge question. And so Augustine is coming down on the side of those who say we aren't necessarily strict pacifists, that sometimes there is a necessity to take up arms. And so what are the parameters for that? And it begins from this moral absolute. Killing is always wrong. But sometimes it can be justified. It's a difference. So the act of killing on its own is always objectively wrong. You can never say killing is sometimes morally good. It never, ever rises to the level of a moral good. At best, it is a morally acceptable evil under certain very tight circumstances. So the act of killing remains an act of killing, whether it's at an electrocutor's chair in a state prison, whether it's by needle, whether it's at the barrel of a gun or the drop of a bomb. Killing is always a moral evil. But sometimes it is acceptable. And that's the starting point of just war. Sometimes. So then what Augustine does is he goes into some categories which actually some elements were part of the Roman army code. I mean, they had a code of conduct that they followed. And our army today, we were talking about just the other day.
We were.
Right? That our army, our military, has its own code of justice. And there are military lawyers that follow that code. And many of the principles of that code trace back to the Roman army and St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas and are resonant with the UN Declaration on Human Rights and global charters, the Geneva Convention. It's not just the Pope whipping something out of his head because he doesn't like the war. He's steeped in that tradition, Jim.
Yeah, and I discovered that. I was a lawyer in the Army. I wasn't a JAG officer.
Okay.
I wasn't a judge advocate officer.
Mm-hmm.
I just happened to be a lawyer who was in the Army but in a different branch. Mm-hmm. And because I was a company commander at one time, running or in charge of a unit, we were required to know the basics of the Uniform Code of Military Justice.
Right.
Not the whole thing and not in depth, but because I was a lawyer, I took a little bit more interest in it. And I was surprised, quite frankly, to read the tenets of it that line up with that kind of moral thinking that you're talking about now. And it seems to me that in this whole issue between the Pope and the President, what seems clear to me is the Pope is coming from a long-standing moral tradition, mm-hmm. and which the President, of course, doesn't and wouldn't understand, and maybe go into that a little bit as to from that, as you were just talking, from that moral tradition, why you believe the Pope has taken a rather strong stand, and not an anti-President Trump stand, right, in my opinion, right, but a strong stand for the morality of the issue, and in the process, getting into the just war theory.
Well, that's great. Like, why is this Pope saying this thing at this time?
At this time,
right.
Exactly.
The same reason that Pope Francis spoke against war, and Pope Benedict before him, no liberal. Pope John Paul II, also no liberal. Him spoke against war and armaments. A man who lived through the Nazis and the Soviet communists spoke against war. Let's back up before him, Pope Paul VI.
Yeah, World War II.
That was Vietnam.
Cold War.
Cold War in Vietnam.
Right.
Before him, Pope John the 23rd. Cold War. Before him, Pope Pius XII. Should I go back?
Yeah, that's what I was, yeah, you could go.
So my point, Jim, is to say he is the successor of that long-standing tradition, speaking in the same voice as all of these popes that had preceded him in the modern era. So when those other popes witnessed great conflict, they spoke for peace. Every single one. So is he. We're in great conflict now. Greater level of conflict than many of us have seen in much of our lifetimes. And so the Pope, as a moral voice, feels he needs to speak from within that tradition for peace. And just reminding everybody of what we've been holding on to for a long time. So why did he step in? Because the world is at a very dangerous stage right now. And he is the Pope, not of Washington, D.C. He's the Pope of the whole Catholic Church in the whole world. He's in Africa now.
Yeah, I know. I know
he's the pastor of the Catholic Church in Africa.
Yeah, which is a large contingent, the Catholic Church in Africa.
It is, indeed. And so he sees how a conflict here causes suffering from unrelated people way over there. We can see that in the global economy being shattered, and not shattered, but shaken right now. And real people are actually suffering real harm because of decisions made far away. And so he needs to be also that voice. Just when I was at the UN, somebody asked me, well, what are you doing to feed hungry people in Africa? I'd say, that wasn't in my portfolio. It would have been if I'd been assigned it. I said, my job is to point out to people who have power that your decisions affect those people there. People whom you will never see. Your decision here is like touching a spider web, right? You touch it here and it jiggles over there. And the Pope needs to remind people of power, any kind of power, economic power, political power, military power, and especially of great power, if I can kind of paraphrase our president, the greatest power, which we are, we're the wealthiest country, largest military, and the greatest economy. Those are the three powerful things in the world. And so we need to be reminded that how we use our power affects not just the price you pay for gas at your pump down the street, although it does, but it affects whether people in Asia are going to eat this year.
Yeah, that's true.
Mm-hmm. And a Pope who has the whole world as his congregation is uniquely poised to bring that voice into the discussion too. That's why he jumps in.
And but I think my perception of it is that he jumps in with a little different approach, and I could be wrong, or a little different. He's got that South Side attitude, doesn't he?
I was just going to say, he's a outsider.
Yeah, he is, and he's calm. He's soft-spoken, mm-hmm. but he's pointed.
Yes.
And it's like every word, like I just read early in the program, one paragraph, just mm-hmm. one paragraph of the Easter message, and you can hang, maybe throw out a conjunction and a preposition here and there, but you can hang on every word.
Right. Right.
And he's having such in my opinion, such a profound impact. One, because he is who he is and how he conducts himself, but and also because he's such a contrast to the person running our country. There have been other leaders in our country, other presidents in our country, who have gone to war and who have had to make that decision. But they seem to make it maybe a little bit more measured and more carefully and think about these consequences that you were talking about before, about if you're going to war in Venezuela, or if you're going to war in Iran, or if you're going to come home and go back to war in Cuba, or whatever you're going to do, it impacts everybody all around this country, all around this world.
The world.
Yeah.
And again, the Pope is the Pope of the world.
Right.
So he will hear, just like he will say from a religious perspective, God hears the cries of the poor. That's biblical. Even if you're not a Catholic Christian and don't care about what a pope says or does. Read the Old Testament, read the prophets, read the Beatitudes, read the Gospels. And you see, God has a very, very deep and abiding and eternal care for the poor, the sick, the powerless, the weak. And so when the Pope speaks like that, there's an innate humanity that he touches as well. We believe from a religious perspective that was put there by a divine creator. But you don't have to believe in a divine creator to know that there is an innate goodness to most people. And that innate goodness has compassion for people who suffer. It's just a human thing. You see children who haven't gone to a religion class have great care for their suffering pet, or grandma's having a bad day, or they know this. This is a human thing. So the Pope is just saying, look around the world. People know this, whether you're a religious person or not. And I think that's one reason why a lot of non-religious people are coming to the side of the Pope. You would listen to late night comedy or political figures that, man, this Pope is saying things that we got to take his side. We're taking his side. It doesn't make them practicing Catholics. Then have to, but they're seeing in what he's saying. This is good. What he is saying resonates with a deep level of humanity, whether you're religious or not. And I think that's a tone he's striking, which gets to the whole just war teaching. If we can kind of circle back to that,
let's do that,
because that emerged as a deeply human troubledness with war, with violence. And so even before Augustine, Christians and the Roman army were wondering, are there any limits? Are there any limits to the use of force against people? And the answer, if the answer is no, then we're doomed. So the answer has to be yes. So if there are limits, and again, it's either yes or no. If there are limits, well, what are they? Follows then what's called the just war tradition. And again, the starting point is killing is never it's never a moral good. At best, it's a morally acceptable evil under certain conditions. So what are the conditions? Two categories. We can go through them. I kind of summarize them for myself here.
But we got a few minutes here. Let's do that.
One is what they call in Latin a jus ad bellum, so the justice of war. Before you go to war, some conditions have to be met. And then there's jus in bello, justice in the midst of war. So before you go to war, certain things have to be in place. And once you're within war, certain limitations have to be met. And if any of those conditions doesn't get met, that war is not just. The whole war is not just. That's pretty tight. This was actually applied by Pope John Paul II. Remember, communists, Nazis, conservative Pope.
Yep.
And he said that the American war in Iraq did not meet those criteria. We didn't hear people screaming about that, but he said that.
And just to follow up, I saw something yesterday that amazed, I don't say amazed me, but when you're talking about that criteria, in my perspective, we entered a war. We didn't enter a war. We premeditatedly went into a war. I'm not sure there was any regard given to any of the criteria that I can think of, but interesting enough, a former Secretary of Defense under George Bush, his name was Caspar Weinberger, not a Catholic, hardly a Catholic, a man of the Jewish faith, who laid out very strategically and very carefully the just war theory in modern, in my opinion, modern times and in modern conflicts. And he had 8 criteria. I wish I could remember them all. I can't. But he had 8 criteria, which he said, and told the president, before you do anything in in whether and we end up in Desert Storm. It wasn't. This is the first George Bush. This isn't the Iraq War. This is the prior, and he said it needs to meet these 8 criteria, and if it doesn't, then it's not a just war.
And remember, he went to the United Nations first to see if the world community would support it, not mandate it, but would they support it? Would they feel that it meets the internationally recognized secular criteria, many of which have antecedents in just war theory? And the UN said that you would be authorized. Now, they could have taken that authorization and not used it. They were authorized. Then he went to Congress. And every congressman and woman had to speak out loud their yes or their no publicly. I remember listening to those hearings. It was you and I, junkies like that, right? Which, only, and so that was done. So what are the criteria for entering into war? First of all, it has to be a just cause, so such as self-defense or defense of an innocent other who is asking for help. So a just cause. There are others, but a just cause has to be the right intention. So the intention has to be to correct the injustice, not for territorial gain, not for exploitation of wealth, not for the sake of punishment, but rather for some right intention. It has to be the last resort. All nonviolent options have to have been exhausted. Right. So last resort has to be conducted and announced and declared by a legitimate authority, a proper lawful authority. It has to be proportional. In other words, the good that you hope to accomplish by this has to outweigh the bad that is going to happen. So the good that you accomplish
outweighs the bad.
Outweighs the bad. Has to have a likelihood of success. In other words, by doing this, you're actually going to succeed.
Sounds like getting an injunction in court. But
right, isn't it? Right. So those are the criteria. So if you don't think you're going to succeed and you don't know what you're there for and you're not the one who can announce it in the first place, well, this doesn't look like this hitting any of these boxes here. Then once you're in war, the rules of conduct of war, in war, you have to differentiate between combatants and non-combatants, civilian and military. So what they call civilian immunity.
That one is really important. Let me stop you there because I know our producer is getting antsy.
Okay.
It's time for us to kind of wrap it up, and I wish, and maybe we will go a little bit longer. It just won't be today, and it just won't be on this one. But I hope everybody's listened to that. I hope you give a lot of thought to those points because it's clear to me, and I'm just one guy, but it's clear to me that our war in Iran meets none of that, and that's a problem. That's the moral problem that we face. I'm so glad you're here. It's so good for you and I to do this in front of microphones instead of maybe a scotch or something or a drink, but that's also enjoyable. I can't tell you how important I think this is, and we're going to have to follow up on this and maybe some other things. We kidded earlier when we were coming in, and Father was talking about, I said, we ought to do a show together. Just let's the two of us do. And he says, a priest and a lawyer walk into a bar, right? Or walk into a studio, into a podcast studio. But in any event, it's always delightful. It's always informative and interesting. I appreciate you so much and being here.